What's up, horror fans? It's Danny from the Lacercast, and I am exhausted after 4 long days and evenings at New York Comic Con. A wonderful time of the year, as always. Had a great time, met some cool people, got tons of great merch, artwork, sat for a few really cool panels, some of which I'll be talking about on this channel. For instance, the entire Midnight Club Q&A discussion with Mike Flanagan up on stage, and the entire cast of the Midnight Club, hosted by Perry Nemiroff of Collider. That entire Q&A panel is up on our channel now. I was sitting front row for it. I also got a chance to see the Chucky panel, which we were not allowed to record in, so I will talk about more when I cover Chucky episode 2 of season 2 later this week. So that's something to look forward to. We're covering Shudder's 101 Scariest Horror Movie Moments. We're covering Chucky. We're covering The Midnight Club. We are going to be talking about the new Hellraiser. Halloween Ends is coming out next week. Saturday night after Comic-Con, I went to a comic book store in Manhattan, Forbidden Planet, and I met director Jackie Kong, who directed Blood Diner, one of my favorite crazy oddball 80s horror films. And then tonight after Comic-Con, I went to the new Alamo Drafthouse in Staten Island, where they were playing Blood Diner, and Jackie Kong was there for a Q&A. It was super fun. She is totally cool, and if you have not seen Blood Diner, go out of your way to see Blood Diner. I am here tonight, 2 minutes into this video, to talk about episode 2 of Queer for Fear, Shudder's 4-part series on the history of queer horror, kind of a follow-up to their horror noir documentary that was incredible back in, I believe, 2018 or 19. Anything that happened before the pandemic, I just kind of lose track of. The first episode covered really the origins of horror. You have Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, Oscar Wilde, F.W. Murnau. Here we get into the 20th century with, and this episode is basically broken up into halves, each half dedicated to a giant figure of horror in the 20th century: James Whale and Alfred Hitchcock. James Whale was, you don't have horror today without James Whale. We mentioned Mary Shelley in the first episode. Well, James Whale is the person who took her work, over 100 years later and turned it into Frankenstein. He did 4 major horror films in the 1930s, obviously Frankenstein. Then he did This Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, and Bride of Frankenstein. And what's interesting is that I've seen all of these movies multiple times, and if I had to rank them, the original Frankenstein, while it is a classic, would be at the bottom. I think Bride is a hilariously amazing masterpiece. I actually just saw it in the theaters a couple of weeks ago with Chris and our friend James. The Invisible Man is one of my all-time favorites, with Claude Rains giving an amazing lead performance. And This Old Dark House is so good, and not enough people saw that movie. I'm actually hoping that from watching this series, more people who have never seen The Old Dark House check it out. It might actually be up on Shudder now. It's a Universal horror movie. Boris Karloff is in it. Gloria Stewart, the old woman, Old Rose in Titanic, she is in that movie as a much younger person, and she's very pretty in it. So James Whale is like the father of, I guess we could say, modern horror, or at least theatrical horror for Universal in the early 1900s. And he was very gay. He was openly gay, and he wasn't open to, in the sense that you know, they make this point that he wasn't like parading it around, but he also wasn't keeping it a secret. They also, and this is where the history teacher in me loves this, they also get into the whole pre and post code era of cinema. The first three movies, Frankenstein, This Old Dark House, and The Invisible Man, were made pre-code, and then Bride of Frankenstein, which came out in 1935, came out after the Hays Code was put in, which basically tightened what you could put in movies, and any allusions to homosexuality or deviant behavior, or even like drugs and alcohol, were considered to be no-nos, and you could not include them. And the people who they have, you know, I always refer to them as the talking heads in these documentaries. They do such a good job of pointing out the moments where it is so, you know, to white cisgender men, you know, just straight people, where we might not get the context of, oh, this is a very, you know, coded moment, and it's very obvious that Whale is doing something, or a character is being a little flamboyant. So I just saw Bride of Frankenstein in the movie theater, and I didn't look at Dr. Pretorius in any certain way, but now watching this episode and seeing some of his mannerisms and listening to some of the words that he chooses to say to Dr. Frankenstein, and the way that, and they make this point, and it's really funny, how he barges in on the Frankensteins on their wedding night, and it's basically like, nope, you guys cannot consummate your marriage because you and I, doctor, two men, we need to go talk about making life together. And it was such a you know, and again, Bride is post code, so it you don't realize it, but if you're, you know, queer, you're going to notice those coded messages. They also reference the scene with the old man and how he talks about how, you know, how he's been waiting for somebody to come along and be with him, even though he can't see. And, you know, Frankenstein, and even the ending where Frankenstein tells Victor and his wife, Elizabeth, to go. You live, go. And then he points at Pretorius and goes, you stay. We belong dead. And he pulls the lever, which destroys the lab. And this idea that, you know, there's something wrong with being, you know, different, the outsider, homosexual, and that Frankenstein identified that otherness in Pretorius. And then they, you know, they mentioned the sad story. James Whale ended up committing suicide later on. But, you know, a queer man directing the work of Mary Shelley, who they went into such great detail using primary source documents to show her queerness, and, you know, this queer teenage girl, woman in the Victorian age, basically, creating sci-fi horror. And now you have James Whale, a fairly openly gay man, bringing those visions to life. And it's very interesting. And again, if you have not seen The Old Dark House, I cannot recommend it enough. And there's so much coded behavior in that. They even reference that there's a character of this old man, like 100-year-old man, that they find in The Old Dark House. And the old man is actually played by a woman, which was, you know, again, pre-code. You know, maybe post-code, they would not have been allowed to do that. The second half of the episode covers Alfred Hitchcock, and they talk about the complex relationship that he has with sexuality, with sex. There's many references to him being queer or having queer tendencies, which I had no idea about. Again, just like with The Old Dark House and how I really hope that people who watch this go and find that movie. One of the big movies that they reference with Hitchcock is Rope. I saw Rope probably 25 years ago. I had a coach in high school who was a big cinema buff, and he would lend us movies. And one of the movies that we watched was Rope, and it is a phenomenal Hitchcock film. It's basically the Leopold and Loeb case, where two students murder one of their friends for fun because they think that they are, Nietzsche's Übermensch. They are the Supermen, so that they can get away with it. And then they invite their teacher, played by Jimmy Stewart, and a bunch of other people over for a dinner party with the body in the room. And it's Hitchcock shot it in one continuous take, only pulling deep into the camera would pull straight in, and when they needed to change the camera, change the film, but it's one continuous take. It's like a play, and it's wonderful. And they talk about how one of the actors in it, how it was written by Arthur Laurent, who was openly gay, and that he cast his lover, Farley Granger, as one of the two leads. And so you have, Hitchcock working with gay writer, casting gay actors in his film, and how the two main characters in that movie they're described as basically, lovers who are having like lovers' quarrels throughout the movie. And a lot of the talking heads kind of go back and forth joking about, top and bottom and stuff like that. And I found it, I thought it was very funny, but it's a great movie, and if you haven't seen it, you should check that out. And then they get into, of course, The Birds, and then, of course, Psycho. They talk about some of the women that wrote for him: Patricia Highsmith, Daphne du Maurier, and how they were queer, and that there's always these queer tendencies in Hitchcock stories. Even though, for most people, when they think of Hitchcock, they think of his obsession with the beautiful blonde, whether it's Tippi Hedren or, Marion Crane in Psycho, or Grace Kelly in Vertigo, or I'm struggling to remember movie titles. I'm very tired. Rear Window, thank you. Of course, they get to Psycho, and for those of you who don't know, for anyone who doesn't know, Anthony Perkins was not openly, he was married, of course, he has a son, Osgood Perkins, who is a film director, who is interviewed for this documentary series, and he talks about, his father, and, how Anthony Perkins had been almost like a James Dean-esque leading man type until Psycho, when all of a sudden Hitchcock kind of outed Anthony Perkins by having him play this, for the time, 1960, the fact that he is dressing in his mother's clothes, and at the end he's taken on his mother's personality. It's the first time I remember ever seeing something in a movie of cross-dressing or that nature, and Anthony Perkins being a queer man, it really had an impact on him and his career going forward after Psycho. And what I really like is that they go into the Psycho sequels, which of course Hitchcock doesn't play a role in, but it was really about Anthony Perkins taking back control of his career through the Norman Bates character, to the point where in part 3 he directed it, and he basically took charge of that role. And his son, talks about how they knew, and even when Anthony Perkins died of AIDS, that, you know, they had a story, him and his mother and his brother, they had a story about blood transfusions, but they knew how his father contracted AIDS, and it's just, it's a really, you know, harrowing story, because, you know, you basically talking about a man who had to live most of his life in the closet while trying to conform to what society views as the norms. There's 2 more episodes in this series, and I'm really loving it so far. The talking heads, as I refer to them, are fantastic. I'm just going to roll out a few of them. Leslie Headland, Michael Feinstein, Justin Simeon, Alonzo Duralde, Tony Cypress, who I'm pretty sure I might have met outside of a Starbucks in Brooklyn once, Nay Beaver, Emily St. James, Lachlan Watson, who's in the new Chucky series, Don Mancini was featured in this, and of course Brian Fuller, who directs. That's not everybody, but everyone who talks in this is fantastic. I just credit to the amazing panel of queer horror contributors and writers and directors and critics and historians. It's just a fascinating watch, even if you're not queer. It's a fascinating watch if you love horror. And I want to just address one last thing before I end the video, and that's some schmuck on Twitter. Maybe it was because he wanted the attention, so I'm not mentioning his name, but you've probably seen the post if you are a horror fan. Complained that, you know, the woke left or the woke people have, you know, ruined Hellraiser because they replaced Pinhead, the male Pinhead, played by Doug Bradley, with a transgender woman. And this person, you know, one of my friends on Twitter said it best: tell me you know nothing about Hellraiser or Clive Barker without telling me you know nothing about Hellraiser and Clive Barker. So much of the horror that we watch is thanks to the queer community. The Chucky panel that I went to at New York Comic Con on Tuesday, on Friday, what is like a celebration of queerness in horror. And it's not because it's woke, it's because Don Mancini, the creator of Chucky, the character, is a gay man. And when he wrote this series as an addendum to the movies, he wanted a young gay couple at the center of it. So you have these teenage boys in a relationship because that was Don Mancini growing up. Now I'm talking about the Chucky panel. I'll talk more about it in my review for Chucky 2, but it's just the idea that queerness is such a part of horror. I'm a straight man. It doesn't have to be like, I don't feel nervous when they bring up things like this, because I know Clive Barker is gay, Don Mancini is gay, Brian Fuller, who created Hannibal, one of my favorite shows of all time, is gay. You know, and then you look into this series, just the first 2 episodes. I mean, Universal Horror, the godfather of Universal Horror, James Whale, Frankenstein, the Invisible Man. You know, Hitchcock has these tendencies. It's, you know, Candyman is a Clive Barker story. So there's just, queerness is just embedded in horror. And you don't have to make it a woke thing or anything else. You can just accept that it's part of horror, and it's great that they're getting a chance to have a voice and to not have to live their entire lives in the closet. And it comes back to the idea that they said at the beginning of the first episode of this series, is that many times being queer is like horror, being a horror fan. Even today, as an adult, I was at Comic-Con. I was wearing my button-down horror shirt with all the VHS boxes. Horror fans see that and they reach out and they go, oh man, great shirt. Oh, what's your favorite movie from this? And it's a talking point because we feel, horror fans, very often we feel like we are the other, so we look for other horror fans. That's why we go to conventions. That's why there are horror YouTube channels. That's why, that's why horror fans talk about the movies they love more than any other group of people, because it's almost like reaching out for those, it's this unspoken bond that we have. It's like, you like that thing that I like, that society is kind of iffy on, and it bonds us together. And if you're a horror fan and the idea that Pinhead is played by a transgendered woman bothers you, you are yelling out loud that you don't understand the very basics of horror. and that's all there is to it. So I love this series so far, and that sidetrack at the end there about the Twitter thing is because this kind of thing is still going on to some degree, where I feel like people like that guy on Twitter would probably be like, ugh, why did I have to have a whole show about this? Like, who cares? Like, and this is why it exists. And I'm very glad it does, because it's a great show for horror fans, for horror movie historians, and if you get nothing else out of this show, go watch This Old Dark House and Rope by Alfred Hitchcock. So this has been Danny from the Lasercast. So much more is coming up this week. Pete is going to finally have his Megan Stockton interview out later this week. We're going to have our review of 101 Scariest Horror Movie Moments on Shudder. We're going to have my review of Chucky Season 2, Episode 2. We're going to be talking more about The Midnight Club, Mike Flanagan's new Netflix series, and super cool, cannot wait, Tuesday night, friend of the channel, David Weiner is back. He is coming on our show again to talk about In Search of Darkness 3. The Kickstarter is available now until the end of the month. He's coming on to talk about that. And then I got even more stuff. I can't stop. I'm addicted to this shit right now because I'm going to the Brooklyn Horror Film Festival next week. I have at least 2 screenings that I'm going to. So if I ever get to sleep, it'll be a miracle. So this has been Danny from the Lasercast. You have a wonderful night, and I'll see you very soon.